Thank you. So if you are having trouble seeing the slides, they can put the lights down one more, or if you'd rather keep them on, totally up to you. Okay, so I'm sure that you guys are mostly familiar with the GLO, the General Land Office. It is an independent agency that was created by the federal government in 1812, and the purpose of it remains to handle the survey, platting, and selling of federal lands. And the federal government had been selling land prior to 1812, but there was a lot going on in the post-Revolutionary War era, and there were a lot of fish to fry, and Congress was passing laws as quickly as they could, setting up the logistics of running the country. And so the feds were selling land prior to 1812, but the system was imperfect, and they were trying, by 1812 they had a much better idea of how they wanted to handle it. So it set up this agency to handle all of that paperwork. And federal land, as you can see from the map, the brown states are state land states. And they were selling land to people before the Revolutionary War, and those states were acquired a variety of ways. Mostly it was English land, because obviously we were a British colony. Some of the land, basically it was just mostly British. The states, they weren't states, the colonies sold or granted land to people who wanted to own land within their jurisdictions. And if you'll notice, it's not just the 13 colonies. There's also, as we know, Tennessee was part of North Carolina. Kentucky was part of Virginia. West Virginia was part of Virginia. And then up here in the extreme northeast corner, there was a little state boundary line shuffling as well. But essentially, it's the 13 original colonies and the property that was under their purview at the time. Texas, of course, is different. It was its own country just prior to statehood, and so it still handles its own land, as does Hawaii, because it also was its own country. So the blue states are the federal land states, and those are the ones that people purchase land from the General Land Office. And so we're going to take just the smallest trip down a little rabbit hole. It's not too far. Since the General Land Office is an agency of the federal government, their records are mostly held at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., but not all. And when you're doing any research that involves federal records and items that may be at the National Archives, it's a good thing to remember that they are not there for genealogists. They're not there for historians. They are there to safely hold records of various types. And their mission, their mission stated by law, is they receive records from the originating agency. So if they don't have a record, it's because that agency has not yet released it to them. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it's just still with that originating agency. Also, when they get the record, they keep it in the arrangement that they received it in. So with the case of land records, it's really important for us to remember where the land office is, because the General Land Office records were organized by land office and then sub-organized within each land office jurisdiction. And the land offices varied. They kind of overrode state boundaries a little bit, especially when it was still a territory rather than a state. And obviously county boundaries were changing. And so really what county the land is a little irrelevant in terms of the land office. The other thing is, as people pushed west and things got crowded and land offices got really busy, the feds would open up a new land office. So maybe if you have an early settler somewhere in Illinois, and they bought a parcel of federal land in 1830, if they bought an adjacent parcel 10 years later, it might have been from a different land office. If the original land office had been just overrun and had too much work, maybe they opened up a new land office closer, and that is a little bit the case in the Oregon Territory. So that's something to keep in mind. If you see a record for your ancestor and you know that ancestor didn't move, but what is it doing in different land offices? Well, like county boundaries can change, land office boundaries can change. So yeah, that is federal, and again, it's any federal record. And so the BLM, the General Land Office in 1946 was placed under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Land Management, which in turn is under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior. The BLM has not released all of their records into the custody of the National Archives. So some BLM records, like some of the tract books and whatnot, are actually at BLM facilities rather than the National Archives. And some of that depends on storage space, some of it is, who knows why people do what they do in that place. So when this whole system was started, the rectangular survey system, the charge of the General Land Office was to survey land. And you can see from this lovely colorful map, the different colors actually do mean something. That was, they would open up chunks of land at a time. And they would define a chunk of land, send the surveyors out, and they would create, you can see up here, Oregon, Washington, this is the Willamette Meridian. They had to have something, they had to have a starting point somewhere. So there's the Willamette Meridian, which is present-day Oregon and Washington, the El Diablo Meridian in Northern California, and then so that they had something, you know, to create the little grid. That's the baseline, and that's the one roughly along the Oregon-Washington border, and that's for land here. But you can see throughout the countries there are different meridians and different baselines that create the grid system. Right there where the arrow is, that is the starting point, and that is where the state of Ohio and what was then Virginia and Pennsylvania, where they all met together. The actual starting point itself is under the Ohio River, but there's a monument, I think it's on the Virginia side, maybe the Ohio side. That is the starting point for the section township range. And because they didn't have satellites back in the late 1700s, that's why they set up the additional meridians and baselines so that they could correct for errors and whatnot. When they platted the land, this is where the meridians and the baselines come in. I don't know how familiar, probably some of you are familiar, some of you may not be. You have the meridian, you have the baseline. This is just like those graphs that troubled us in math class in high school. So this blue box right here, this is a township, and this is 36 square miles, and it is measured township 2 south because it is the second square south of the baseline. It is also this range 2 east. It is the second square east of the meridian. And so when you see these designations, you can look from the rest of the graph, you can see that that is how it's measured. Then within each township are 36 sections, and each section is a square mile, and they're numbered, and they snake across, so this is a little disorienting. It just, I'm sure most of you have.
Do you have any reason why they did that? You know?
I don't know. I looked for that, and I do not know the answer to that. That is not how I would have done it, but nobody asked me. So within each section are continuing subdivisions. You have the northwest quarter, so named because it is a quarter of the whole, and it is in the northwest corner. And then you start getting into some really fun legal descriptions. The northwest half of the northeast quarter of section 2, township 2 south, range 2 east. So that is this. So if you go from here, then the section, and then the township, and then the end part of the legal description should also list the Willamette Meridian, the El Diablo Meridian, whichever meridian. Early on they numbered the meridians, and then they decided to name them. I don't know why. No one asked me. And so sometimes you'll see legal descriptions in deed records in particular later on that they won't bother to list the meridian because it's self-evident. If it's in this state, then that's the meridian, and so you can fill in, that the meridian is implied in that particular case. This was kind of a fun picture that I got from the Library of Congress. This is an 1883 survey crew in New Mexico, and yes, that is how they did it. And it is amazing how they were able to do so much with tools that seem so primitive to us now. So a little bit of jargon with regard to federal land records. The first is a patent, and what you say is a land patent. Inventions get patented. Why are lands patented? And it is essentially kind of the same legal concept. It is basically a patent is a piece of paper issued by a government agency allowing somebody to do something, giving somebody the right to do something or have something. So if you have a patent to an invention, the government gives you a piece of paper that says you have the rights to this invention for a period of time. In the case of land patents, the federal government gives you a piece of paper that tells you you have ownership rights to this piece of land. And a patent can only be issued by a governmental agency. So when the first owner sells it in subsequent sales, they give a deed, because a deed is given by a person or a corporation or a group, whatever, what have you. But it's not the federal government. They have the right to issue the patent. And so the legal concepts, if you really stand way back and zoom out, are similar. And that is also the case with a warrant. When most of you are probably familiar with bounty land warrants, a warrant is, again, an official government issued piece of paper that permits the person holding it to do something specific. So if you have a search warrant, a police officer is allowed to search your car or your house or whatever. It's a piece of paper that allows them to do something specific with it. In the case of a bounty land warrant, the piece of paper is issued to the veteran, and it allows them to take that piece of paper to any land office anywhere and turn it in and use it as money to obtain federal land from the land office. So again, the warrant, it's kind of a weird term, but again, the more global definition is fairly consistent. So the record keeping process, this Oklahoma is a land office, another Library of Congress photo of a land office in Oklahoma. The local land offices were opened once the surveying was complete, and they maintained a tract book, and the tract book was organized by township. It was not organized by date. It was not organized by person, sadly. And they're mostly not indexed now, which is really a pain, because the tract books contain relinquished claims. If someone started a purchase of land or started a homestead grant or a homestead file or whatever, if they gave up the land later, it's still in that tract book as a canceled claim. And that can help if you have people on the move, which a lot of us here in the West had people on the move. That can help to place our people in a certain place at a certain time, and you can get a little more finely grained idea of where they were and when between the censuses. Yes?
What if somebody did a homestead and then just left?
That happened.
How did they find out?
That happened a lot. Usually the neighbors knew if the people had abandoned their claim. Yeah. And if it was an excellent piece of land, probably someone else came along and said, I cannot help but notice that there is an abandoned house here. This looks like some good land, and some people have actually put a little bit of work into it. Maybe this is a good place for me to stake my claim. And then they could corral the neighbors and ask if the people had abandoned the claim. And there was a time period, I can't remember exactly what the time period is, as far as if you've left your claim. It was not long. It was, well, you had 5 years to perfect your claim. The timelines varied depending on when you got the land, but you could only, there were actually, and I've seen files where people would have to explain, maybe they went into town for the winter so their kids could attend school, and they had to explain that. I have not been off this land during the entire time period except these 2 winters when we moved to town so my kids could go to school. They had to explain if they were gone for even more than 1 or 2 months. And so anyway, if the neighbors all said, yeah, the Smiths, they moved on, you could go into the land office and say, this claim looks like it's abandoned, and then they could get affidavits from the neighbors, stake their claims, start their time period, and then they could get their homestead land or what have you.
Didn't they also, if they didn't pay taxes, knew then that they'd gone?
Not necessarily. The tax structure was later, and if there were property taxes, they were not, the whole system of property taxation was not fully formed during that era, and so there were taxes, but if they were essentially squatting on land that the land office hadn't opened yet, and that happened, and I'll show you that in just a second. Maybe they didn't pay taxes because there was no governmental agency to collect taxes yet. And so some people like to stay at the forefront of the migration for that reason. So every month, the local land office would gather up all the paperwork for the month and they'd send it back to Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. would look through the paperwork, oh, this is all in order, and they would then they would issue the certificate, the patent certificate for the land. And this took a while because DC has not always been known for its instant attention to matters at hand. And but anyway, once the local land office had signed off that, oh yes, your paperwork is complete, then and again, things were sometimes a little gray. If they wanted to sell the land, usually they would go ahead to look, the local jurisdiction would let them sell the land, even if they didn't have the actual patent in their hand. Generally, that was frowned upon. But again, needs must. And let's see. Anyway, the paperwork that the General Land Office had sent to Washington, D.C., that became the land entry case file. And the case file is what we want because it has the good stuff. There is an index to some of the, it's called the 7 States Index, and it is canceled, relinquished, or rejected land entry case files. And it covers the states of Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Florida, Louisiana, Nevada, and Utah. Sadly, not Oregon and Washington. But if you do have people in those states, you can look for the 7 States Index and look to see if one of your people may have walked away from a claim for whatever reason.
Most of the patents were signed by the President of the United States?
No. Early on they were, but the presidents quickly noticed that they had a lot to do. And a lot of people were buying federal land, and so that duty got shuffled off to their clerks or whatever the designated official was in their particular bureaucracy. So yes, it was signed by the president, signed by, on behalf of the president by, John Smith, the clerk. And so that's how it was.
So those signatures weren't necessarily the president that you saw on the...
After...
This would have been early 1830s.
Even then, it was already shuffled off to clerks.
Darn.
I want to say it was...
You had something, yeah.
It may actually have been around the same time they created the General Land Office, around 1812. You can kind of tell if you look at a patent and you see the signature. You can compare it, obviously, you can go on Wikipedia and see a copy of the president's real signature, and then you can kind of compare and decide. So the first land ordinance was the land ordinance of 1785, and you can tell from the date that this land ordinance was passed by the by the Continental Congress. It was under the Articles of Confederation. We didn't even have the Constitution yet. But we had land, and the government was in a deep, deep financial situation. They needed to raise money to pay back states from the Revolution, to pay the soldiers from the Revolution, just to pay. They had so many bills. And to set up the government. So they wanted to start settling federal land at the earliest opportunity. So the Land Ordinance of 1785, it created the public land survey system that we talked about a few slides ago with the rectangular survey system. That's when they decided where the starting point was. They set up the bureaucracy at the time. There was not the GLO, but at the time they set up a bureaucracy to handle the sale of the land. And they also, at that time, is when they began reserving Section 16 for school lands. And that was a nice boon for everybody. It meant that schools got money and the federal government didn't have to pay for any of it.
Later on, didn't they add Section 36 to that same thing? I think so.
Yeah, I think so, yes.
But I don't remember when.
Under what circumstances, or if
Yeah.
it was maybe something individual states did. I forgot to check, check on that. There was another Land Act in 1800 and another one in 1804. The original Land Act had established a minimum acreage of 640 acres at $2 an acre. And not many people could afford that price for the land. That was $1,280, which was a lot of money. It's not nothing now. So at the time, that was a ton of money. So what would happen is you started getting, they wanted to avoid this feudal system from Europe where you had a few incredibly rich landowners that owned everything. They did not want to establish that kind of system. Also, speculators would purchase the land at $2 an acre and then resell, say 10 acres, 40 acres, whatever people could afford, for maybe $210 an acre or $250 an acre, and that just really hurt. So in 1800, it reduced the minimum allowable purchase. It reduced the acreage to 320 from 640, which made purchasing a little more affordable. It also introduced a credit purchase feature where you could take 50% down on the cost of the land, and then you had 4 years to repay the rest. And that really helped too. That really helped to increase sales because it made the land much more affordable and within reach of a wider variety of individuals. Then in 1804, it further reduced the minimum purchase to 160 from 320 acres. And so everything was going along fine. Then there was the War of 1812, and then came the Panic of 1819, which was the economic slump leading up to that. People were having a hard time making their payments. They were giving back the land. They had to give back all the land. If they had put 50% down and then made payments for 2 years and they were defaulting on the rest, they lost the whole thing, not just 3/4 or half of it. And this was really adversely impacting the economic situation of many people. So in 1820, they introduced the Land Act of 1820, and it did a number of things. It further reduced the minimum purchase so that if people had the money to buy land, they could buy less of it, which would cost less. It reduced the price of the land from $2 an acre to $1.25 an acre, again making it more within reach. It also allowed defaulting borrowers to give back the land they hadn't paid for but keep the rest, and that really, really enhanced the quality of life of people who were really struggling. And it helped to stabilize the overall economic situation of the time.
Could the land, the person was working on the land and he had his 4 years to pay for it, but he decided he wasn't going to. Could he sell off half of it? You couldn't sell it until he actually owned it.
Right, he didn't receive the patent to the land until
Okay.
after it was fully paid. let's see, oh, and then it also established an 8-year payback time rather than 4 for people who, you know, could continue to make payments, just needed a little longer. And then the fiscal conservatives of the group said, you know, we should get out of the mortgage lending business. This is really too complicated, and people are living on our land for free and then giving it back. So it eliminated the credit purchase feature for borrowers. So the borrowers that they had already lent money to essentially lent money. They hadn't lent cash, but they were living on it and hadn't fully paid for the land. So it eliminated the credit for purchase feature, but it was a lot, if you did have the cash, it was a lot easier to purchase. And from that time on, federal land was sold only for cash on the barrelhead. And that simplified the logistics of it a lot. Let's see. Oh, and the land ordinance of 1820 was not, it was not replaced until the Homestead Act of 1862. So this is the Bureau of Land Management website. It's GLO Records, GLO, General Land Office, glowrecords.blm.gov. The website address is at the bottom here. This is, when you go into the main place, you click on the option to search the land patents, because as we now know from our vocabulary lesson that the patents, that was how for the most part, that was actually how the federal government memorialized people's ownership in the land. So if you have someone that you think an early settler somewhere, you enter the state you think they're in. You can also add a county if you want to. And then, like any other search feature, if you're looking for a John Williams, there's going to be a lot of them. And in this case, I was looking for William Davis. And trust me, there are a lot of Davises in the state of Illinois. And so but I knew that my guy, I had known from other research I did that his property straddled a county line, and so I did not put in a county. And when I first searched the second red arrow, that is, I don't know how clear that is for you guys, but I typed in last name Davis, first name William, and then later, after I got 14 pages of William Davis results.
Oh, that's better.
Oh, good, okay. It wasn't very clear here, but I put in his middle initial, which his middle name was Yearly. Who knew? So William Y. Davis really cut down on the number of hits that I got. And in this case, there were 5. And so this is the list of all the William Y. Davises. And actually they're all my guy, as it happens. And so you can see the list here, and you click right here, you can see that it's a hot link because it's underlined. That means there's more information. And just from here you can see there's the name, and that the date is the date that the patent was signed by, not the president, but on behalf of the president by whatever clerk in Washington, D.C. was doing the signing that day. Sometimes it was a couple years later that they would actually sign it. In this case, I think it was 1.5 years it took for the actual patent to come through. So look at the dates, but don't necessarily say, oh, well, my ancestor was there 15 years earlier, because it may actually be that parcel of land that they had been on the entire time. There's the document number, is the certificate number, the patent number, and then there's a shorthand legal description, and then what county it's in now. So you click on the hot link and you come to this screen, and this screen is actually longer. There's a little map thing, which I'll show you in a minute. So here you can see that this is the land office, Shawneetown, Illinois. This is the authority under which the land was sold, and in this case it was April 14th, 1820. I personally didn't care what authority they had to sell the land. They sold the land. There was a patent. Who cares? Well, that's part of the sub-organization within the land office, is they have all, in the Shawneetown land office, they have all of the patents that were issued under the authority of 1820. They're all in one spot. And then Homestead are from Shawneetown, are in another, another file cabinet. It's, we just kind of have to humor the people at the archives and give them what they want because they're the big bureaucracy and that's the price of admission. Here is the total acreage of the plot, and it's good to keep track of that if you're doing like an in and out real estate table and you're going through the deed records of a particular county and like how the heck did they get into title of this land? Well, for one, that's a clue that you should always look here before you start looking at the deed records if you're in a federal land state because you just don't know. And then keep track of the acreage because a lot of times people would sell off if they had 320 or 640 acres, maybe they would sell off part of it, maybe they would transfer part of it to their offspring. And if you have someone 50 years later and you're trying to find out, well, who were his parents, if that person in a deed record received land for $1, even if he paid for the land, because some parents kind of made you pay, not just $1 in love and affection, or if you don't know how they came to own that land, but all you know is it's Alexander Davis, and it was part of the original land patent from William Davis. That is a hint that maybe William Davis gifted some land to his son. So again, I won't belabor the point of what real estate records can do for you, but again, you just want to kind of keep an eye out, and then the patent number is right here. This is a land entry case file. And this was what was in the file itself. And this is super cool because it was dated November 5th, 1832, and this is William Yearly Davis's actual signature. Mm-hmm. And I was so excited to find this. Okay, so that's the cool factor. And then basically it just says that I am applying to purchase this piece of land, and so this basically is the signature of the local land, the registrar of the local land office saying, all right, I acknowledge you want to buy this land. Where's your cash? Here's the paid receipt. It said that William Davis paid what he needed to pay in order to purchase that land. And then here is the certification that from the local land office saying, here's this guy, he wants this land, he paid me the money, I have it in my hot little hand. He gathered those 3 documents up and sent them into Washington, D.C., and a blazingly fast 18 months later, the patent was issued. So these early files, if it's a cash sale, that's a lot of times this is all you'll get. It's just the application, the paid receipt, and the certification. Yes?
So are these documents digitized, or did you dig these up from the local land office?
I dug these up in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives. These case files are in Washington, D.C. And I was at a conference, or not a conference, I was at an institute, a week-long institute about federal records. And it was held in the archives building in Washington, D.C. Not to brag, but it was so cool. And so part of what I did there, if you actually go to Washington, D.C., you can make your own copies for free. If you have your digital camera, your phone, you take pictures, and it's all free, which is really good because if you order them online, they can be really expensive. So that was just your basic cash sale file. There was, about 20 years later, there was another act, like I kind of alluded to before, as we swept our way west. Sometimes the settlement of the land occurred before the land was surveyed and before the land office was set up. In 1841, Congress created a vehicle by which people who were already there cultivating the land, they built a house, they were living there, where they could have essentially first right of refusal when they were allowed to purchase the land on the same terms as anyone else, but before the land went up for public sale, they were allowed to purchase it. And so that's what a preemption claim is. In this case, it was up to 160 acres. You had to be a head of household, which is a man 21 or over, or a widow. The thing about this that was kind of cool, you had to be a citizen or an immigrant who had filed first papers. And that particular requirement of the act generated paperwork. And we love paperwork. And then you had to have been living on the land for 14 months or longer. Yes?
So this 160 acres then has to be the plotted quarter section
No.
for that land, right?
Not necessarily.
So you can cross over
There-
sections.
Oh,
this-
yes.
This was very common in the Vancouver area,
Mm-hmm.
very common. And the boundaries were nowhere near what a section would be because they farmed a certain area of land and then, so they said, this is what I have. So when the surveyors came around, they surveyed that piece of land and then filled in the sections around it
Yeah.
with quarters or government lots, whole nother instruction, but that's very common in our area.
Yeah. And a lot of Kansas and Nebraska was settled via preemption claims. So if you have ancestors there, the example I'm going to give is actually in Missouri. Let's see. Yes. There's nothing to indicate, nothing overt that indicates it's a preemption claim. So if you go to the GLOW records at glowrecordsblm.gov, and in this case, I was trying to find land for John Tate in Missouri. And again, 16 pages of results later, I eventually found him, but I'm not going to bore you with that needle in a haystack search. It turned out his middle initial was M, so I put the middle initial in there so that you do not have to see 16 pages of records. Here's the second screen. This is the result. I'm going to click on the hot link, and there's still nothing here to indicate it was a preemption claim. Here is this screen again, and I can see it's still the authority that under which the land was sold is still this Act of 1820. So there's nothing that says 1841. I can see from the date of the patent issue date in 1846, that was early for Missouri, and given it was up kind of north and a little bit west of Kansas City, if you research in an area a lot, you may know that there were a lot of preemption claims or in Vancouver or wherever, so you might keep an eye out. So what you should always look at when you are on the GLOW Records website, you always check the patent image. And it's right there. You click on the tab. It takes a little bit for the PDF to load, but you actually do get an image of the patent that was issued. And you can, download it as a PDF to your computer at home, and it's kind of cool. In this case, here is my John M. Tate, and at the top, where it says certificate number 882, is written the word preemption. That is how you know it's a preemption claim. Sadly, they did not always write preemption. Alas, human beings are prone to error, but in this case, I saw the word preemption, so so I knew to look for it. And so when I was in Washington, D.C., I scurried down there and got the entire case file. And it turned out that this is, I'm not going to show you the entire file because there were a few different pages. But here it is, the paid receipt, John M. Tate. We received the money for the land. And here is an affidavit and there was more than one affidavit. This is an affidavit from his neighbor saying, yeah, this guy settled on or before a particular date on this land, and he's been there continuously. In this case, I think it was 4 years. And so it's not as good as a homestead file, but it's not nothing. And because this guy has a common name, it was hard for me to locate him. And here, I knew where he was, and he moved around a lot too. And sometimes this can even help you tell the difference between two people of the same name if you know for a fact that, turned out this is not my John Tate. And I was really sad when I figured that out. But, because, for different reasons. But if your family is, you know for a fact they're somewhere else, and the preemption claim says they were over here at that particular time, then you know, same name, different person. Keep looking. So there is also one we're familiar with, the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, free land to settlers who arrived in the Oregon Territory before December 1st, 1850. This 1850 Act replaced the provisional land claim system, which was begun in 1843 when Oregon was still just like the Oregon country. It wasn't even a territory yet. And the US and the British government were still not fully on the same page vis-a-vis their boundary lines. So they were working all that out. They figured it out in 1848. Congress eventually passed the Act of 1850. It was 300, and this actually was a precursor to the Homestead Act, and it did a couple of things that were different. In this case, it gave out 320 acres to an unmarried white male citizen, 18 years or older, so it lowered the age, and again, it specified the citizen, non-citizen. But a married couple could get 640 acres, and the second half was put in the wife's name. Prior to that, this did not occur because from a legal perspective, a wife was one and the same legal unit as the husband. So it was impossible for a wife to own land separately because the wife was not a separate legal entity. And this applied to everything. It wasn't just land, it was everything. The wife and the husband were one unit, and the husband was the one who got to sign the papers. Fortunately, that's not how it works now. At the time, that was true. So having the wife own land in her name was pretty revolutionary at the time in terms of federal land sales. Settlers who arrived after December 1st, but before 1845, could receive half the acreage, but they were still, and this was free land, by the way. If you stayed on it for 4 years and cultivated it, then at the end of that time period, it was free, which was awesome.
Quick question for you, because it strikes me, I never really thought about the implications of the second paragraph about half in his name and half in her name.
Mm-hmm.
But my great-grandparents purchased land, when they left Illinois and went to Iowa, they purchased land,
Mm-hmm.
and half of that land is in her name and half is in his name, but it was transferred by a deed from an individual. That is really strange to me.
Ooh, Iowa must have been a little different.
Either
huh?
that, or maybe she was a women's liber in 18, whatever.
That is really interesting. Ooh. I wonder what the Iowa law said. So to locate donation land claim files, there's a little bit more of a process, but we can still do it. We still do it through GLO records. In the case of my person, Lewis Cooper, and I'm going to show you one additional thing here. He settled in Polk County, Oregon. And what I did here, if you can see his name right here, I typed in his last name of Cooper, and shockingly, there are tons of Coopers in Oregon. But I didn't know how he spelled Lewis. So what I did is I typed in a % sign. This is a wildcard sign. And honestly, why they use different wildcards? Not my decision. No one asked me. Mine is just to follow their rules. The % sign is the same as an asterisk. If you're doing a Google search and you put an asterisk in, on GLO records it's a % sign. So that is, it could be just the first initial L. It could be any spelling of Lewis. It could be any spelling of any name that starts with an L. If you put in an underscore, that is the same thing as a question mark in terms of the Boolean operators. If you put in a question mark to stand in for one single letter, on GLO records, it's an underscore. So that's another tip that kind of helps, especially, and you can do that on the last name too. Especially if you have a name that people tended to misspell. This search engine is very literal. It doesn't do any sound like or anything like that. It is very literal. If Cooper isn't Cooper, then it's not going to call it up, even if it turns out it was misindexed and it's a typo. It's very literal. So if you know they owned land or you really think they did, keep working with the idiosyncratic probably an operator until maybe you can find it.
Oh, just on the wild card, so I know, okay, you put a percentage in there.
Yes.
So, other options, would you have, say you knew it started with an L,
Mm-hmm.
so
I put
would you,
so I put L % sign.
is that an L?
Yeah, it's a lowercase L, sorry.
Okay. So you did put L percent.
I put L %
So you
sign.
could just put percent, or you could put L percent,
It,
or, I'm just trying to think of,
Yeah, you could
different
put-
options.
put pretty much different options. I don't know, I've never tried to put just a % sign
Okay.
in there.
Doesn't do you any good, because it's still gonna pull out.
Right, 'cause it's
Coopers at
still-
that
that's
point.
right.
It's still gonna pull all the Coopers, and you don't have to input any first name if you don't want to. If you wanna see every Cooper in Oregon, be my guest, it will show you.
And then the underscore would just be for
A single
a
character.
single character, so.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Well, it would be something to play around with.
it is something to play around with. So, donation land claim files. You may notice there is a difference between, and this set of names here is not italicized, and, ooh, wait a minute. Really? Okay, and this set of names is italicized, and
It's the same.
99, is it the same? Weird. Anyway,
It's the same.
most Oregon donation land claim files, they do not have a patent image available. It still has the hyperlink, so you click on that, and there's no patent image, because for whatever, since the donation land claim, now I remember, since that system was was stopped so long ago, they took all those files and the feds microfilmed it very early on and put the originals in deep storage. So you are not going to see a patent image because the deep storage occurred prior to the imaging project for the patent images. And when I was in DC, I tried to get a copy of the patent image of my husband's family's original Oregon donation land claim. And I talked to the head land guy, and I might have been begging. Like, please, can I see the original one? And it just wasn't possible, and he gave me the name of he eventually, to get me out of his office, he gave me the name of his supervisor. And no, can't do. They were not going to do it. Apparently just a random genealogist who really just wanted to touch old paper was not a good enough reason. Maybe if I'd had a PhD and was writing a book, perhaps they would have, I don't know. So one thing that I haven't talked about yet is down here, there was a little bit of a map earlier. If you click on these little map boxes and further down on the page, so this is the bottom part of the page, I clicked on the map boxes, and there's a little map that shows where the property is. And this, if the website is working properly, sometimes it hiccups, but just try it again. It's this, and then it has the scale, you can zoom in and out, but this is Monmouth and Independence right here, and this is where his land was. And then this is the entire township parcel. So that's kind of a fun thing to look at if you're trying to figure out where your people are. Locating donation land claim files is also a little interesting. At the GFO, we have all the microfilm right there. And you guys have, there used to be an index, well, there is still an index book that the GFO publishes about the genealogical material in Oregon donation land claims, and it meant Oregon Territory, obviously not just Oregon State. And, but that is pretty much replaced by the Glow Records website. You have all the information you need to find it. Again, make sure you make a note of the land office, because the microfilms are arranged by land office. And Family Search has those microfilms on their website, and you can access them at home. There's a very long list of donation certificates, and mine was in this little highlighted area here. I clicked on the camera. There was no key on top of it. I just clicked on it, and I got to see the actual microfilm, which probably most of you have done. The thing that if you have a donation land claim record, these records are discreetly located in the Family Search Catalog. If you go, like when I went to Polk County, which is where the land was, the donation land claim files, these actual microfilms were not under anything to do with Polk County, because these records were created by the General Land Office and kept by the feds. They're federal records, not county records, and they, the boundary lines of the land office were not consistent with the county boundary lines. So at one point I emailed them saying, can you please put donation land claims in all the counties? But again, who listens to me? The people at Family Search have not done so. So if you have a donation land claim file, you can view it from home, but you have to just remember this is the Oregon and Washington donation land claim files. That's the title of the collection that has them. Yeah.
So, I'm looking at your GFO microfilm collection. So are you saying that what you have at GFO in your microfilm collection is viewable on Family Search?
No.
Okay.
The Family Search their copies of the microfilm they got directly from the National Archives.
Okay.
But we purchased our microfilm from the National Archives.
Okay.
And then it's not just this drawer either.
Right,
There's several
right,
drawers, obviously.
yeah,
But it is all the same microfilm. And the Oregon State Archives has copies of it. If you go onto WorldCat, you can find the Family Search wiki has a link to WorldCat, and you can search for that microfilm series anywhere. But it's easy to see online. You don't even need to go to a family history center. You can do it from home in your bunny slippers. Or you can come to the GFO. So in this case, the file is Lewis Cooper and his wife Jane. The full file is 23 pages because there was a boundary line dispute. And so there was a little bit of paperwork going back and forth about resolving that. And the actual final patent was issued much later because of the boundary line dispute. So there was, and the thing about Lewis Cooper and why he was interested, his wife Jane is the person I was interested in. When he originally applied for his donation land claim, he was a single man. And the cool thing about that is that it talked about, where is it? No, it's not this page. Maybe it's the other one.
Was the land dispute about that next to the last one with a typo in the original land description?
Well, by typo, I mean that term loosely.
Oh, okay.
Because of course there was no typewriter at this time. But they had just mistranscribed the rather involved legal description because it involved segments of different townships.
Scrivener's error.
Yes, exactly. That's a better way of putting it. So, and in this case, you also, I'll talk about that later. This is his affidavit, and again, for people who were born a long time ago, it's often hard to get birth information. In this case, he certifies that he was born in Shelby County, Kentucky in 1796. So that is lovely information.
Yeah.
The Oregon State Archives on their website, they had interns and people going through all these records, and generally, the birth date, if they have a birth date of a person, when you look through their index records, it's probably from the Oregon donation land claim files. But yeah, this is dandy stuff here, and then this is actually Lewis's actual signature. Then there is another affidavit of, this is residency or this is marriage? This is either the residency affidavit or the marriage affidavit, because a year after he applied for the donation land claim land, he married his wife so that he could obtain the other 320 acres. I'm sure that wasn't why they married. That may have come out wrong.
That was the only reason they got married?
I'm sure they were deeply in love.
Especially if they were relatives.
Didn't have her maiden name though.
No, it didn't have her maiden name, although by that point he was her third husband, so any name they would have put down.
Would have been.
But yeah, sadly, sometimes you get a maiden name. And no, come to think of it, the other one. Actually, the one for my husband's ancestor, they were married in Lynn County in this same time period. And the Lynn County, the earliest, like the first year or so of Lynn County marriage records, is nowhere. They don't know where they are. The only record of their Lynn County marriage was from the affidavit in their donation land claim file. So that was, and now that I think about it, it talked about his wife, and it did not list her maiden name either. Nevertheless, sometimes when all you have is hash marks, it's nice to actually get a name. All of this is after 1850, but nevertheless, this is kind of a cover sheet that sort of talks about, and then here it talks about native citizen of the United States, and I'll get to that in just a second. Homestead Act. This took the place of, finally, the Act of 1820. You got free federal land for up to 160 acres if you were a person 21 years or older or the head of household. So if you were a 19-year-old widow, you were the head of household, you could get free land. If you were a single woman over the age of 21, you could get land. If you were a married woman, not so much, but still, it sort of opened up the range of people who were eligible to have land. Also, apparently the 18 years old, if you were not the head of household, they kind of walked that back a little bit. We're back to 21. You have to have been a citizen or filed your declaration of intent. Because this is the middle of the Civil War, there was this never born arms against the United States. So if you were a Confederate veteran, you were not eligible for homestead land. It was not unheard of at all, especially in the federal land states in the South. If they had a younger son that had not fought, was maybe too young to fight, then the son would buy the land, the dad would give him the money, and then they'd have land anyway. Also, the former Confederacy, those states came up with their own homestead programs, just like they came up with their own pension systems because the federal government was not going to give pensions to Confederate veterans, but the former Confederate states did. You had to reside on and improve land for 5 years. This is a picture from the Library of Congress of the very first homestead, patent certificate number 1 in Kansas. The picture was taken in 1887. So this is a homestead case file for my ancestor Neil Monroe. He was born in Scotland. And he moved around so much when he first came to the United States. He was all over West Kentucky. He had been a coal miner in Scotland. He was everywhere. I could not find his naturalization records to save my life, and I was not going to read those court minute books that were unindexed. No. However, he got homestead land in Coos County in the 1890s. And in his homestead file was an affidavit from the Hancock Circuit Court. It was it was a copy of his naturalization, his final papers in 1847. So I knew from his homestead file exactly where this man had naturalized, where he came from, where he had naturalized, when he naturalized, all of that. So I was really excited to find that. Then there were more sworn affidavits from the neighbor. There were a sworn affidavit from himself attesting to his residency, and it listed the improvements made to land. This is where you find out that someone built a 16 by 24 cabin for their wife and 8 children. And yeah. And the barn was bigger, always. In this homestead file, there was also a paid receipt. And why would there be a paid receipt? It was free land. He did not wait the full 5 years waiting period, and he elected instead to pay cash for the land so he could take title, and he ended up selling it. He was getting on in years, and he wanted to move closer to town. So this is the rest of his. And they even wrote legibly too. That happens sometimes.
Amazing.
There were a couple of special cases when it comes to federal land. Bounty land and private land claims. Louisiana Territory, private land claims. People got land from the Spanish government or the French government or what have you. They had to file a claim with the Lands Committee, and this whole process, I'm not going to get into it because that's a full lecture in and of itself. But I will talk for just a moment about bounty land. Cash-strapped U.S. government frequently wanted to pay their veterans or entice people to enlist in the first place, and they did that by offering free land if you agreed to fight for a certain period of time. And this started with the Revolutionary War, and it lasted up to but not including the Civil War. So if you have any veteran, at first it was specific wars, and it was just the officers, and then there was, if you spent a long time in the Army, there were basically subsequent acts were passed of increasing liberality. A lot of the ones that you'll really see in the example that I give is a War of 1812 widow who was able to finally get land. So again, you're back at Glow Records. The thing about bounty land, and this is where our jargon lesson from earlier comes in, I unchecked the box, search patentees and search warranties. I unchecked the box for patentees because I am looking for my veteran. And I don't want, especially if I'm looking for Mr. Tate again, I don't want a gajillion hits on Tates. In this case, I was looking for my ancestor, Wiley Wingo. I know, what a name. And I went into any state and any county because there just aren't that many bounty land warrants, especially in the name of Wiley Wingo, although you'd be surprised. Again, you can deploy wildcards if you have spelling things. The last name is required, first name is optional. And in this case, again, I didn't select any location. And shockingly, there was only one warranty named Wiley Wingo. And so again, you just click on the hyperlink here. I'm going to unpack this list of names for just a second. And I don't know if you can see it very well. Here is Wiley Wingo, and this is a W in that little box. That means he is the veteran. Right above the name is Nancy H. Wingo. This is his wife. And she has a P in that little box because she was the patentee. What happened, Wiley, by the time the act of, this was an act in 1855. Wiley had passed away by then, but it allowed widows to claim bounty land on behalf, according to the service of their deceased husband, so she did so. So the warranty was the veteran, the patentee was the wife. Another thing that was common, there were bounty land warrant resellers. She sold the warrant that she received to a reseller, and the reseller sold it to the top two guys. And so when you come upon the final image, so here it talks about, usually but not always, it has information about what military unit the veteran served in. And then here, this is 1855, it shows the authority and then how much land they got and the document number and all of that. I click on patent images, and there you go. We have Nancy H. Wingo, widow of Wiley Wingo, private, Captain Niblett's Company, Virginia Militia, War of 1812. And that was really cool to find. The funny thing is Wiley Wingo never left the state of Virginia, ever. And he died in 1848. And yet I'm finding him on a federal land record in 1855. So if you have a veteran, do the warranty search for your veteran, because even if you have someone from Virginia or a state land state, never left the state at all, they may yet be in this federal land system. The other thing that was really cool, this is the full patent, and this is what we talked about earlier. This is not Abraham Lincoln who signed that, that was a clerk, alas.
But it tells you who was president.
But it does tell you who was president, which, you could, if you know your dates well, you can kind of figure it out from the date too. But yeah, it's kind of cool to see the name. And, so this is an actual affidavit. Because the widow was claiming the land, she had to prove first, to get a bounty land warrant, you had to demonstrate that the soldier had served. So this, she attested to her husband's service, and then there was follow-up documentation. Also in her affidavit, she talked about that she was married to the said Wiley Wingo in Amelia County, Virginia, the 2nd day of December, 1819.
Wow.
So there were 2 Wiley Wingos. Yes. Yes, it was a family name, and they were about the same age, and they both lived in Virginia. One of them had moved to South Carolina, but I know. Go ahead. Even uncommon names can really get you. It wasn't clear which Wiley Wingo married this Nancy because the other Wiley Wingo married a woman named Nancy. I know. This file, this bounty land file for a man who never left Virginia and died in 1848, this bounty land file established which Wiley Wingo married Nancy H. Jackson in Amelia County in and around 1819. And it wasn't my guy. I know. The other thing that this bounty land did when I was looking to distinguish between the two Wiley Wingos, he died before the patent was issued. My guy didn't die until 1881. So I knew there was a record for a Wiley Wingo serving from Virginia that I had found elsewhere in the War of 1812. And my guy would have been a little young, but it still could have been him. But this also established for sure which cousin was in the war as well. So these files, it never hurts to just go on the website and take a quick look because you never know what you're going to find. Okay, sum it all up. Land records can solve genealogical puzzles. If you have an early settler, check GLO records. If you have a pre-Civil War veteran, check GLO records to see if they received bounty land. If you have an immigrant ancestor, check GLO records because maybe there's a file, there might be paperwork. Always check the patent image looking for preemption or any other weird information that might be on there. You never know what you're going to find. And if you visit Washington, D.C., this is the National Archives building. It is across the street from the Navy Circle. That's what the kind of ship-like looking flags are here. This is the back side of the archives, and this teeny tiny little door right here is where you go in. And this is in the reading room of the archives, and these are all land records. They came in on a cart, and I got to touch old paper. It was very cool. So that, I know, I can say this in front of you guys because I know that most of you would feel the same way, even if you just smile sedately instead of, anyway, so that's it. Are there any other questions?
When it comes to foreign land grants, Spanish land grants in Florida, things like that, do those have to be validated?
Yes.
So I should find a record in the GLO for the validation of a Spanish land grant?
No, you won't. Those would be in the, I know, those are found in the congressional record because the person who had the land submitted the evidence of their claim, saying, I own this land, I really do, the Spanish gave it to me. Here's the paperwork I have that proves this. They would submit it to their local representative of, there was a whole congressional subcommittee for Committee on Land Claims. It would go to DC, the Committee on Land Claims would review it, decide, offer an opinion as to whether the claim should be accepted or rejected. If it was accepted, then the US government would, if it was accepted, it would go to if Congress accepted it, then it was yours. So those are outside of the General Land Office system because the patents, if you will, were issued by Congress rather than the General Land Office records. So you have to, most states have, the Family Search Wiki will have information about how to pursue the records, the indexes or whatever for private land claims. They have a whole section on private land claims. And the other thing that was kind of cool too is federal land did not discriminate by color. So if it is not uncommon, I was looking up a record and I didn't show it here, but there was one who was owned by, it said, I don't remember what his name was, John Smith, comma, FMC, free man of color. And for, if you're doing African American research, that is amazing, even before the Homestead. And again, in Florida, Alabama, a lot of the federal land states in the South, African Americans could own land. And that was huge because it was hard for them to find white landowners who were willing to sell to them. sometimes they had a little trouble getting the neighbor affidavits to prove residency, depending on who their neighbors were. And obviously it was this, you know, it was the South in the 1800s. There were a lot of issues that I'm not going to go into here because it's past time. But I don't want to keep you, but yeah, so the private land claims start with the Family Search Wiki, and they will help guide you through the process. The congressional record is on, what's the name of the website? It's on the Library of Congress website, and it's or it might be through the archives. Anyway, there are.
American Memory? That's not right either, is it?
No, that's newspapers. It'll come to me in about 10 minutes, I'm sure. But anyway, there's the congressional record. Before there were photocopiers, there were people who wrote stuff down and printed it. And so there were books that were essentially indexes to everything that Congress had done. And then you go into the actual congressional record, which is the more complete notes. And I have a private land claim in the St. Louis area, and I was really, really sad because the paperwork for his claim, which was rejected, has not been retained by the archives. It was not, I went through both the land record person and then I went through the congressional record specialist. And even though it, at one point in the records that I was looking for, it said basically see attached Exhibit B for the paperwork, they did not keep Exhibit B. All they kept was his main petition. So, but that was, when was that? In the early 1800s. So that sometimes records don't survive. Yes.
Assuming that you had a patent from the Spanish government that said you owned this property in Florida, and you wanted to get that certified by the U.S., you got this big sheet of something or other that says that with the seal of the head of the Spanish government. Anyway, would you have to give that up? Or would they transcribe it, or what?
You would go to, and I don't know if you could, I'm trying to think, probably you would have to go into your local circuit court and have the court certify a copy, that they would do a handwritten copy of that record.
Because you don't want to
Because
lose it.
no, you don't want to lose it, but a court-certified copy is as good as an original. And I don't know for sure if you had to turn in your original or if a court-certified copy was good enough for the Committee on Land Claims. I don't know the answer to that question
In
exactly.
Florida on the Spanish claims, those documents were retained because you could pull those documents down off of the Florida state website.
Oh. If only I had people in Florida.
Okay.
Sorry, was
We'll find out where it goes from there, so we'll track it down.
Yes, and that?
So all my relatives, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, so perhaps there might be a bounty.
Yes, a bounty land
land
somewhere.
record. What was the initiative for people to do, to get land and sell it, and was that all that common?
Yes, it was very common. If you were eligible to receive bounty land, even if you didn't want to move, you didn't want to do anything, it was like receiving cash. That warrant was like cash, and you could sell it to a middleman for cash. And so people who, well, in 1855, there wasn't a ton of cash around. It was there was cash, but the cash economy didn't really start to evolve until after the Civil War, when so many soldiers were paid in cash. Cash money there just wasn't a lot of currency in circulation at that point, and you could get it that way. And it was, few people, if you were eligible for bounty land, there's an excellent chance that your ancestor applied for it, or your ancestor's widow if they were eligible. Unless the widow didn't last until 1855, or, because there were, Again, if you go to the Family Search Wiki and look up bounty land, there's a whole list of the different acts.
So like in Tennessee, there were a lot of risks to Revolutionary War soldiers before Tennessee became Tennessee, right?
Right.
To expand west.
Right.
Is that a bounty land claim then?
If it was for, if it was a warrant for military service, then that, if they got it because they served in the military, then that is bounty land.
Okay.
But yeah, that's not the only way to get land in Tennessee.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much. That's through the bride, through Gold Records. Because there was timberland, one by